My name is Barbara, and I am 70 years old. If someone had told me a year ago that I would be sitting here today feeling like a stranger in my own life story, I would have laughed and invited them in for tea and homemade cookies. Back then, I believed that love was enough, that the bonds between mother and child were unbreakable, that decades of devotion would always be remembered with gratitude. After my husband's early death, when Stephen was just 15, I single-handedly poured my entire being into raising my son. I sacrificed my own academic pursuits, working tirelessly to ensure his education, his success. I gave him constant emotional and financial support, always a listening ear, a safe haven, tolerating his emotional distance while believing in the enduring power of our bond. He was my world, my purpose, my greatest achievement. Then after a health scare made me yearn for deeper connection, Stephen, with chilling precision, flatly denied any past struggles or my role in helping him overcome them. He gaslighted me, accusing me of exaggerating our history of being toxic to my grandchildren, Michael and Emily. Michelle's insidious influence was clear in every cold word. Stay away. Stephen ordered, his voice flat and final. You're living in some fantasy. My heart shattered. I was discarded, gaslit, utterly alone, my life's sacrifices erased as if they had never happened. Yet, as Robert, my own brother, echoed their dismissals, a professor's meticulous nature ignited a quiet fury within me. What Stephen, Michelle, and Robert didn't know was my lifelong habit of documentation. Extensive journals recording every hidden pain, every attempted connection, every instance of his denial, and recorded phone calls. My truth meticulously preserved for over 30 years. This time, I wouldn't just be heard. I would expose their insidious psychological abuse, reclaim my narrative, and fight for my grandchildren no matter the cost. The drive to Stephen's house felt like traveling to my own trial. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I rehearsed what I would say, how I would explain the growing chasm between us that seemed to widen with each phone call that ended in frustration and hurt feelings. It had been 3 weeks since our last conversation, when I had tried to share my fears about my recent heart palpitations and how they had made me reflect on our relationship. Stephen had listened with what I now recognized as polite impatience, offering perfunctory reassurances before quickly changing the subject to his work schedule. I needed to see him face to face, to look into his eyes and find the boy who used to run to me when thunderstorms frightened him, who had once written me Mother's Day cards saying I was his hero and best friend. Stephen's house sat in an upscale neighborhood that I had helped him afford through years of financial support. The manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway were testaments to the success I had prioritized over my own dreams. I had been so proud when he bought this house, so grateful that my sacrifices had given him the life I had never been able to afford for myself. But today, walking up that pristine pathway felt like approaching enemy territory. Michelle answered the door, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer outfit making me feel shabby in my simple cardigan and sensible shoes. Her smile was polite, but cold, the kind of expression you might give to an unwelcome solicitor. "Barbara," she said, not moving aside to let me in. "We weren't expecting you." "I was hoping to speak with Stephen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's important. About our family, about the children." "Stephen's busy," Michelle replied smoothly. "You really should call ahead. We have very structured schedules, and unexpected visits are disruptive." Before I could respond, Stephen appeared behind her, and my heart sank at what I saw in his face. Not warmth or welcome, but resignation tinged with irritation. This was my son, the child I had raised with endless patience and love, looking at me like I was an inconvenience. "Mom, what's this about?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already regretted asking. "Stephen, sweetheart, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I feel like there's been some misunderstanding about our family history, about how we used to be." Michelle stepped closer to Stephen, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "Barbara, this is exactly what we were talking about. You're always so dramatic. Stephen and I live in the present. You need to stop living in your past and accept reality." "My past?" I repeated the words, hitting me like a slap. "Stephen, our shared experiences aren't the past. They're the foundation of who we are, who you became. Don't you remember the nights I stayed up helping you with your homework? The way we worked through your anxiety together?" Stephen's face hardened, and I saw Michelle's influence in the way he suddenly straightened as if putting on armor. "Mom, you're exaggerating again. You always do this. You make everything about yourself about how much you sacrificed. It's exhausting." The casual cruelty of those words took my breath away. Exhausting. My love for him, my dedication to his well-being was exhausting to him. "Stephen," I whispered, "I just want us to be close. I want to feel connected to you and the children. My health scare made me realize how precious our time together is." "Your emotional demands are exactly the problem." Michelle interrupted, her voice taking on a tone of practiced patience, as if she were explaining something to a difficult child. "Stephen works incredibly hard to provide for our family, he doesn't need the additional burden of constantly managing your feelings and validating your memories." Burden. My need for connection with my son was a burden. My phone rang suddenly, and I saw Robert's name on the screen. Stephen must have texted him while I was driving over, warning him about my dramatic visit. I declined the call, but Stephen noticed. "Uncle Robert's been worried about you too," he said, and I could hear Michelle's coaching in his formal tone. "He thinks you're having trouble accepting that people grow and change, that relationships evolve." The betrayal cut deep. Robert, my younger brother, who had always been jealous of my close relationship with Stephen, was now part of this campaign to rewrite our history. "Stephen, please," I said, my voice breaking, despite my efforts to stay composed. "I just want to feel like I matter to you, like the years we shared meant something. Don't you remember when you were 16 and had that panic attack before your SATs? How I held you all night and helped you practice breathing exercises." Michelle's laugh was soft but cutting. "Barbara, you're proving Stephen's point right now. You're making his teenage anxiety all about you. Healthy parents don't keep score of every time they comforted their children." "I'm not keeping score," I protested. "I'm trying to remind him that we have a bond, that we've been through things together." "Mom," Stephen said, and his voice was colder than I had ever heard it, "you need to stop this. If you can't have a normal conversation without bringing up old issues and making yourself the victim, then maybe we need some space." Space. From his mother, who had devoted her entire life to his happiness and success. And frankly, Michelle added, her tone becoming more authoritative, "Your constant focus on negative emotions isn't good for Michael and Emily. Children need positivity, not a grandmother who dwells on problems and makes everything dramatic. My grandchildren, my beautiful grandchildren, who lit up my world with their laughter and hugs and innocent questions about everything from butterflies to the stars. Now I was being told that my love for them was somehow toxic. If you really want to be part of this family," Stephen continued, his words clearly rehearsed, "you need to get some professional help for your emotional instability. Michelle knows a therapist who specializes in helping people who have trouble accepting reality." Accepting reality. I repeated numbly. You need to understand that your version of our family history isn't necessarily accurate, Michelle explained with false kindness. Memory can be unreliable, especially when it's clouded by emotional needs. A good therapist can help you separate fact from fiction. The room seemed to spin around me. My son and his wife were telling me that my memories of raising him, of sacrificing for him, of loving him through every challenge were unreliable fiction, that my emotional needs had created a false narrative of our relationship. Until you get help, Stephen said finally, I think it's best if your visits with the children are supervised, and you can only come here by invitation when we decide it's appropriate. Supervised visits with my own grandchildren, as if I were a dangerous stranger rather than the woman who had read them bedtime stories and baked their birthday cakes and taught them to plant seeds in little pots on my windowsill. I stood up on shaking legs, my vision blurred with tears. I was determined not to shed in front of them. I should go, I managed to whisper. That's probably best, Michelle agreed. Stephen needs to focus on his family's well-being, not managing your emotional crises. As I walked back to my car, I could hear my phone ringing again. Robert, no doubt ready to reinforce whatever narrative Stephen had fed him, ready to tell me that I was being dramatic, that I needed to accept reality, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened. My son, the child I had raised with endless love and patience, had just told me that my love was a burden. My daughter-in-law had suggested that my memories of our shared life were unreliable fiction, and they had used my beloved grandchildren as weapons threatening to limit my access to them if I didn't submit to their version of reality. But as I drove home through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar, something else began to stir beneath the heartbreak and shock. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more determined. I had spent over 30 years documenting my thoughts and experiences in detailed journals. Every milestone of Stephen's childhood, every challenge we had faced together, every moment of connection and growth. I had recorded phone conversations when his memory of events differed dramatically from mine, initially just to understand the discrepancies, but now those recordings felt like evidence. Stephen and Michelle thought they could gaslight me into believing that my entire life's work as a mother was invalid. They thought they could erase decades of love and sacrifice with casual cruelty and psychological manipulation. They had forgotten something important about retired professors. We don't just remember things, we document them. We preserve evidence. We build cases based on facts rather than convenient narratives. The war between us had just begun, and they had no idea what kind of opponent they were facing. A woman who had devoted her life to truth would not be silenced by lies, no matter how cleverly they were packaged or how confidently they were delivered. The campaign against my reality began in earnest the following week. It started with small things that I might have dismissed as coincidence if I hadn't been paying such careful attention to the pattern emerging around me. Letters I sent to Michael and Emily were returned unopened with "Return to sender," written in Michelle's careful handwriting across the envelopes. When I called to ask Stephen about it, he claimed the children had asked not to receive mail from me because it made them feel guilty and confused. Guilty about what? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. About not being able to give you the kind of relationship you want. Stephen replied smoothly, "They're just kids, Mom. They don't understand why you need so much from them emotionally." But it was the social media posts that truly revealed the scope of their campaign. Michelle had created what she called a family gratitude page featuring carefully curated photos of their perfect life. There were pictures of Stephen with his children at school, events, family dinners, with Michelle's parents, holiday celebrations, with various relatives and friends, everyone except me. The most painful post showed Michael and Emily baking cookies with an elderly woman I didn't recognize, captioned, "So grateful for all the grandmothers in our lives who bring joy without drama." The implication was clear. There were good grandmothers who brought joy, and there was me, who apparently brought only drama. The comments section was filled with praise for Michelle's wisdom in protecting her children from toxic family dynamics. Friends and acquaintances who had known me for years suddenly seemed to accept this narrative without question, offering support for the difficult decision to set boundaries with negative influences. But the most devastating blow came when Stephen called to inform me about the family counseling sessions they had arranged. Dr. Hartwell specializes in helping families heal from long-term emotional manipulation. He explained his tone, suggesting this was a generous offer rather than an ultimatum. She's very experienced with cases where one family member has created a false narrative about their relationships. Stephen, what false narrative I'm talking about? Real experiences we shared, things that actually happened. That's exactly what Dr. Hartwell can help you understand. Michelle's voice chimed in from the background. How our emotional needs can distort our memories of events. How we sometimes create victim stories to avoid taking responsibility for our own choices. The therapy sessions were scheduled for the following month, but only if I agreed to certain conditions. I would need to acknowledge that my memories might be unreliable. I would need to stop bringing up ancient history and focus on building healthier patterns for the future. And I would need to accept that my emotional needs had been excessive and unfair to Stephen throughout his life. It's really quite simple, Dr. Hartwell explained during our preliminary phone call, her voice professional, but clearly aligned with Stephen's perspective. Adult children often struggle with parents who haven't learned appropriate boundaries. Your son is trying to build a healthy family environment, and that sometimes requires difficult conversations about past patterns. What patterns? I asked. Loving my son, being involved in his life, caring about his well-being. Sometimes what we perceive as love can actually be controlling behavior, she replied gently. Emotional enmeshment, difficulty accepting that our children are separate individuals with their own lives and choices. The language was sophisticated, clinical, designed to make me question my own instincts and experiences. But underneath the psychological jargon, the message was simple. My love for Stephen was the problem, and I needed to be fixed. It was during this period of systematic invalidation that I overheard a conversation that shattered what remained of my hope for reconciliation. I had stopped by Stephen's office to drop off some insurance paperwork he needed, hoping for a brief neutral interaction that might begin to rebuild our relationship. His secretary told me he was on a call, but would be free in a few minutes, so I waited in the reception area. That's when I heard Michael's voice through the partially open door of a conference room, talking to someone on his cell phone. "Yeah, my grandmother is kind of crazy," he was saying, his young voice casual and matter-of-fact. "She's always trying to make Dad feel bad about stuff that happened when he was a kid. Mom says she has problems with reality and makes up stories to get attention." My heart stopped. This was my grandson, my sweet Michael, who used to beg me to read him the same bedtime story over and over now, casually describing me as crazy and manipulative to his friends. "Dad says we have to be nice to her because she's old and lonely, but we're not supposed to believe her stories," he continued. "She gets really upset when we don't remember things the way she does. So we just have to agree with her and then tell Mom and Dad what she said." The conversation continued, but I couldn't hear any more words over the rushing sound in my ears. My grandson had been coached to humor me while reporting my conversations back to his parents. My relationship with him had been turned into a surveillance operation. I left the insurance papers with the secretary and drove home in a daze, barely able to focus on the road through my tears. That evening, I sat in my study, surrounded by 30 years of journals, and tried to make sense of what was happening to my life. It was then that I allowed myself to remember the secret I had buried for decades, the sacrifice that made Stephen's current betrayal almost unbearably cruel. When Stephen was 17, just before his senior year of high school, I had been offered the opportunity of a lifetime. The Morrison Fellowship in American Literature, a prestigious program that would have allowed me to complete my doctoral dissertation while working with some of the most respected scholars in my field. It was everything I had dreamed of since I was young, the chance to finally pursue my own intellectual ambitions after years of putting Stephen's needs first. But that same summer, Stephen had developed severe anxiety that bordered on agoraphobia. The pressure of college applications, combined with his unresolved grief over his father's death, had triggered panic attacks so severe that he couldn't leave the house some days. He needed constant reassurance, careful monitoring, and intensive support to function. I could have accepted the fellowship and arranged for Stephen to live with my sister during his senior year. Other people suggested exactly that, pointing out that he was nearly an adult and needed to learn independence. But I could see the fragility beneath his teenage bravado, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the terror in his eyes when he tried to imagine navigating his final year of high school without me. So I turned down the fellowship. I told the committee that I had family obligations that prevented me from participating, and I never told Stephen what I had given up. I wanted him to recover without the burden of guilt, to believe that staying home to support him had been an easy choice, rather than the sacrifice of my life's greatest opportunity. For the next year, I worked with him every day to rebuild his confidence. I drove him to school when his anxiety was too severe for him to take the bus. I helped him practice relaxation techniques and breathing exercises. I celebrated every small victory and held him through every setback. By the time he graduated and left for college, he was strong again, confident, ready to build the successful life that he now lived. But he had no idea what I had given up to make that recovery possible. Now, 30 years later, that same son was telling me that my memories of supporting him were exaggerated, that my emotional investment in his well-being had been excessive and unhealthy. The boy I had saved from his own anxiety was using my love as evidence that I was emotionally unstable. The irony was crushing. I had sacrificed my intellectual dreams to protect Stephen's emotional health, and now he was questioning my mental stability. I had given up my chance at academic recognition to ensure his success, and now he was demanding that I accept that my version of our relationship was unreliable fiction. But as I sat there surrounded by evidence of my devotion to him, journal entries detailing his struggles and victories, photographs of his achievements that I had celebrated as if they were my own letters he had written thanking me for my support. Something crystallized in my mind. Stephen's gaslighting wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic and deliberate, designed to rewrite the history of our relationship in a way that absolved him of any obligation to acknowledge my sacrifices or return my love. Michelle's influence was clear in the sophisticated psychological language, the clinical detachment, the way my natural parental emotions were being pathologized. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what happens when you try to gaslight a retired literature professor who has spent her entire career analyzing texts and documentation. I had evidence, decades of evidence, and I was about to use every research skill I had ever learned to build a case that would expose their manipulation and protect my relationship with my grandchildren. The war between truth and convenience was about to begin in earnest. And this time, I wouldn't be fighting with emotions and pleas for understanding. This time, I would be fighting with facts. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who apologized for disturbing my quiet breakfast. As I signed for the envelope, my hands remained surprisingly steady, though my heart was already bracing for what I knew would be another devastating blow. Cease and desist order, the letterhead announced in stark, unforgiving letters. Below Stephen's name, written in the cold language of legal documents, was my formal banishment from my son's life. You are hereby ordered to cease all contact with Stephen Martinez and his family, including but not limited to direct communication, written correspondence gifts, and physical proximity to their residence or the children's educational facilities. Violation of this order will result in legal action for harassment and stalking. But it was the attached restraining order that truly took my breath away. According to the sworn statement, I had been making threatening phone calls, engaging in erratic behavior, and causing severe emotional distress to the family. Stephen claimed that I had showed up at his office in an agitated state and had been following the children and making them uncomfortable and afraid. Every word was a lie, but they were lies told with legal authority behind them. I was now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my own grandchildren. The statement included what Stephen claimed were examples of threatening behavior, including my attempts to give the children letters and gifts, my refusal to accept boundaries, and my persistent attempts to manipulate family members with false memories. I read the document 3 times before the full implications sank in. I couldn't attend Michael's school play next month. I couldn't shop at the grocery store where I might accidentally encounter them. I couldn't even drive down their street without risking arrest. But I had one last desperate idea, one final attempt to reach the son I remembered beneath the stranger he had become. That evening, I compiled a small photo album of pictures from Stephen's childhood. Not the posed formal photographs that might grace a mantle, but the candid moments that captured our real relationship. Stephen at age 8, grinning gap-toothed as he showed me a butterfly he had caught and carefully released. Stephen at 12, concentration, furrowing his brow as I helped him build a model airplane. Stephen at 16, exhausted but smiling, after we had worked together all night to finish his college application essays. With the album, I included a letter, not a defense of my actions or an argument about our recent conflicts, but a simple recounting of memories that only the 2 of us could share. The night he was 10 and couldn't sleep because of nightmares, how we had talked about courage, and I had taught him to imagine himself as a brave knight protecting his kingdom. The afternoon when he was 14 and came home crying because classmates had mocked his stutter, how we had practiced speaking exercises together until his confidence returned. I knew I couldn't deliver it to his house or office without violating the restraining order. But I remembered that he always ate lunch at the same cafe near his office on Fridays, a habit that dated back to his college days when I used to meet him there to discuss his studies and offer encouragement. So I left the album and letter with the cafe manager, asking him to give them to Stephen when he came in for his regular lunch. It was a simple request from one human being to another, my last attempt to remind my son that we had once been more than adversaries in a legal dispute. I never expected what happened next. The following Monday, my phone buzzed with a notification from Facebook. Michelle had tagged me in a post, something she had never done before. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I opened the app and saw an image that would haunt me forever. It was a photograph of my photo album and letter sitting in a trash can. The items I had chosen with such care, the memories I had curated with such love, discarded like garbage. The caption read, "Some people just can't take a hint. Trash belongs in the bin. Shaksh boundaries matter. Shaksh toxic family. Shakshi moving on." The post had dozens of likes and comments, friends and acquaintances offering support for Michelle's strength in dealing with difficult family situations. Several people shared their own stories of cutting off toxic relatives, creating a chorus of validation for the decision to throw my love away. My phone rang almost immediately. Stephen's number appeared on the screen, and for one desperate moment, I thought he might be calling to apologize, to explain that Michelle had acted without his knowledge. Instead, his voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "Don't ever contact us again," he said without preamble. "You're dead to me." The line went silent, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with the echo of those words reverberating in my mind. Dead to him. My son, the child I had carried for 9 months and raised for 18 years and supported through every challenge he had faced, considered me dead. Within hours, Michelle was making calls to mutual acquaintances, spreading a carefully crafted narrative about my escalating behavior. I was stalking Stephen and harassing the children. I was a deranged old woman who couldn't accept that her son had grown up and moved on. The restraining order was proof that they had tried to handle the situation quietly, but my mental instability had forced them to seek legal protection. That evening, I found myself sitting across from Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in narcissistic abuse and family estrangement. I had found her through a support group for parents who had been cut off from their adult children, and she was the first mental health professional who didn't immediately suggest that I needed to examine my own behavior and make amends. "Barbara," she said gently, "I can see that you're carrying something deeper than what you've told me, something that makes this betrayal even more painful than it already is." I had never spoken about it to anyone, not to friends, not to family, not even to the therapists I had seen over the years when the weight of keeping Stephen's secret had become almost unbearable. "Dr. Chen," I whispered, my voice breaking, "there's something about Stephen's childhood that he doesn't know. Something that makes his accusations about my parenting. It makes them..." The words came slowly, painfully, like extracting splinters from an old wound. The truth about Stephen's father, the secret I had kept for 30 years to protect my son's memory of the man he had idolized. Stephen's learning disabilities had been severe, but undiagnosed in an era when such things were often dismissed as laziness or defiance. His struggles with reading and mathematics had triggered constant frustration and emotional outbursts that his father, a brilliant engineer who valued intellectual achievement above all else, had seen as character flaws rather than neurological differences. "Your father was impatient with Stephen's struggles." I told Dr. Chen, the euphemism feeling inadequate to describe the reality. He would call Stephen stupid, lazy, worthless. He would compare him to other children, ask me why I had raised such a failure. Stephen would come to me in tears, confused about why nothing he did was ever good enough. I had tried to talk to my husband about his treatment of Stephen, but he had dismissed my concerns as overprotectiveness. "The boy needs to toughen up. he would say. "The world isn't going to coddle him the way you do." So I had become Stephen's shield, absorbing his father's criticism and redirecting it away from my sensitive child. When his father called him stupid, I would later find Stephen and help him with his homework, celebrating every small victory and rebuilding his confidence. When his father compared him unfavorably to other children, I would remind Stephen of his unique gifts and talents. Stephen never knew. I continued, tears streaming down my face. After his father died, I let him remember the good times, the moments when his father was proud of his achievements. I never told him about the cruelty, the constant criticism, the way his father made him feel worthless for struggling with things that weren't his fault. I had carried that secret for 3 decades, protecting Stephen's idealized memory of his father, while absorbing all the pain and confusion of those difficult years. When Stephen struggled with anxiety and self-doubt as a teenager, I had helped him work through it without ever revealing the source of his damaged self-esteem. And now, I whispered, this child that I protected from emotional abuse for his entire childhood is accusing me of being emotionally abusive. The son I saved from his father's cruelty is telling the world that I'm the one who damaged him. Dr. Chen sat quietly for a long moment, understanding the cosmic cruelty of the situation. "Barbara, you realize that Stephen's current behavior, the gaslighting, the need to control narratives, the inability to tolerate any challenge to his version of reality, these are often symptoms of childhood emotional trauma that was never processed or acknowledged." "You mean he's repeating the patterns his father used on him?" "It's very possible. Children who grow up with emotional abuse often develop sophisticated defense mechanisms. If Stephen learned to survive by denying his own reality, by accepting his father's version of events, even when it contradicted his own experience, he might now be using those same techniques on you." The irony was devastating. In protecting Stephen from the knowledge of his father's abuse, I had prevented him from processing and healing from it. Instead, he had internalized those patterns and was now using them against me, the very person who had sacrificed everything to shield him from that kind of treatment. As I left Dr. Chen's office that evening, I felt something shift inside me. Not just heartbreak or anger, but a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about my relationship with Stephen anymore. This was about breaking a cycle of emotional abuse that had been passed down through generations, hidden behind closed doors and protected by family loyalty. Stephen might be lost to me, trapped in patterns he didn't even recognize. But Michael and Emily were still young, still learning how to understand family relationships and emotional boundaries. If I couldn't save their father, maybe I could still save them from inheriting his learned cruelty. The battle ahead would be the most difficult of my life, not just fighting for my reputation or my relationship with my grandchildren, but fighting against decades of buried trauma and learned behavior. But I had something Stephen had forgotten about in his campaign to erase me from his life. I had evidence, 30 years of careful documentation, records of his struggles and my support, proof of the love and sacrifice he was now denying. And I had something even more powerful than evidence. I had the truth carefully preserved and protected, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows where it had hidden for far too long. The war between love and manipulation was about to begin in earnest, and this time I wouldn't be fighting alone or defenseless. This time I would have the courage to speak truths that had been buried too long in the name of protecting people who no longer deserved that protection. Stephen's next move came with the precision of a public relations campaign, transforming our private family tragedy into a media spectacle that would haunt me for months to come. The phone call came from my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, her voice tight with awkward sympathy. "Barbara, dear, I thought you should know. There's a story about you and Stephen on Channel 7 tonight. I'm so sorry. I turned on the evening news with trembling hands, and there was my son sitting in what appeared to be a professional interview setting, looking composed and sadly heroic. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Local business owner speaks about setting boundaries with difficult parent." "It's been incredibly hard," Stephen was saying, his voice carefully modulated to convey both strength and vulnerability. "My mother has struggled with mental health issues for years, and recently her behavior became concerning. She would make excessive emotional demands, create dramatic scenes, and unfortunately, her instability was beginning to affect my children." The interviewer, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and practiced empathy, nodded sympathetically. "That must have been so difficult for your family. How did you know it was time to set firmer boundaries?" Michelle appeared beside Stephen, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. "We tried everything," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. Family therapy, gentle conversation, setting small boundaries first. But Barbara seemed to interpret any attempt at healthy limits as rejection. She would accuse us of terrible things, create elaborate stories about our family history that simply weren't true. The camera cut to Robert, my own brother, sitting in what I recognized as his living room. "I've been worried about Barbara for years," he said, shaking his head sadly. "She's always had a tendency toward drama, but lately, she seems to be living in a fantasy world where she's the victim of everyone around her." I watched in horror as they painted a picture of me as an unstable, manipulative woman whose own family had been forced to protect themselves from my toxic behavior. They used careful language, concerning patterns, emotional manipulation, protective boundaries that made their cruelty sound like responsible mental health advocacy. But it was the photographs that truly devastated me. Professional shots of Stephen's family looking peaceful and happy with Michelle, and the children gathered around Stephen like a portrait of domestic bliss. The clear implication was that this happiness had only been possible once I had been removed from their lives. The story aired again the next morning, and by afternoon, it had been picked up by several online platforms. Comment sections filled with strangers offering support for Stephen's courage in protecting his family from toxic relatives. My name became associated with cautionary tales about difficult parents who couldn't let go of their adult children. But the cruelest blow came when I discovered what Stephen and Michelle had done to my grandchildren. Through a mutual friend whose daughter attended the same school as Michael, I learned that my grandson had written a school essay titled, "Why My Family is Happy Now." The assignment was meant to be a simple reflection on gratitude, but Michael's essay had been carefully crafted to tell a story. My family used to have problems because of a person who made everyone sad, he had written in his careful 10-year-old handwriting. She would yell and say mean things and make my mom cry. But now that person doesn't come to our house anymore and we can be happy. My dad is brave and protects us from people who want to hurt our feelings. The teacher, apparently concerned by the content, had contacted Michelle, who had used the opportunity to share more details about their difficult situation with my mental health struggles. Within days, the story had spread through the school community, painting me as a dangerous presence that Stephen had bravely removed from his children's lives. Emily's contribution to my destruction was even more heartbreaking. For a class project about families, she had drawn pictures and recorded a short video explanation. The drawing showed a happy family that included Steve and Michelle and both children surrounded by hearts and smiling sons. But in the corner of the paper was another figure, a small, dark shape with an angry expression and hands that looked like claws. "This person used to make us sad," Emily's 8-year-old voice explained on the recording. "She would come to our house and say scary things and make Daddy upset, but we don't have to see her anymore, so now we can be happy all the time." Michelle had somehow arranged for these innocent childhood expressions to be shared beyond the classroom, further evidence of the trauma I had supposedly inflicted on my grandchildren. My own grandchildren, whom I had loved with every fiber of my being, had been turned into weapons against me. The professional sabotage began shortly after the media coverage aired. Phone calls to my office started going unreturned. Speaking engagements that had been confirmed for months were suddenly canceled due to scheduling conflicts. A conference where I had been invited as a keynote speaker quietly removed my name from the program without explanation. Stephen had clearly been making calls, sharing concerns about my mental stability with colleagues and professional contacts. He never made direct accusations, just subtle suggestions that I might not be in the best position to represent academic institutions, that my recent family difficulties might impact my professional judgment. The investigation into my teaching methods began as a whisper campaign, but quickly gained momentum. Anonymous complaints to the university administration alleged that I had shown favoritism to certain students, that my grading practices had been inconsistent, and that I had created hostile environments for students who disagreed with my perspectives. None of these accusations were true, but they didn't need to be. The mere existence of an investigation was enough to taint my reputation. Speaking fees dried up. Publishers stopped returning my calls. The supplementary income that had made my retirement comfortable disappeared almost overnight. The gaslighting campaign was so systematic and pervasive that I began to question my own memories and perceptions. When everyone around you insists that your version of reality is false, when your own family publicly describes you as delusional, when professional colleagues start avoiding you because of whispered concerns about your mental state, doubt creeps in like poison. I found myself rereading my own journals, obsessively searching for evidence that my memories were accurate, that my love for Stephen had been real and reciprocated. But the constant external pressure made me question everything. Had I really been as supportive as I remembered? Were my sacrifices as significant as I believed? Was my love as pure as I had thought? Or was there some hidden manipulation that everyone else could see but I couldn't? The panic attacks started about 6 weeks after the media coverage aired. I would wake up in the middle of the night gasping for breath, my heart racing, my mind cycling through endless loops of self-doubt and terror. The isolation was profound. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact. Even my hairdresser began treating me with cautious politeness rather than the warm familiarity we had shared for years. The final symbolic blow came on a rainy Thursday morning. A package arrived at my door sent from Stephen and Michelle's address. Inside were my old university yearbooks and academic awards, items I had given them to keep for posterity, tangible proof of the life I had built before becoming a mother. But every photograph of me had been carefully cut out or scratched over with black ink. My name had been removed from award plaques with surgical precision. Academic honors that had taken decades to earn were defaced beyond recognition. The accompanying note was brief and devastating. You are no longer part of our history. Please stop trying to rewrite the past to make yourself the hero. Some stories are better left untold. I sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by the mutilated remnants of my professional legacy, feeling like I was disappearing in real time. not just from Stephen's life, but from existence itself. They weren't just cutting me out of their future. They were erasing me from the past, systematically removing evidence that I had ever mattered to anyone. But somewhere in that crushing darkness, as I held the ruins of achievements, I had once been proud of something crystallized in my mind. This level of systematic destruction required planning, coordination, and resources. It wasn't the spontaneous reaction of a hurt son protecting his family. This was a campaign, deliberate, calculated, and designed to utterly destroy me. And campaigns require strategy, documentation, and evidence. All things that someone with my academic training and research skills was uniquely qualified to analyze and counter. Stephen and Michelle thought they had won by isolating me completely, by turning my love into evidence of my instability, by making me question my own sanity. But they had forgotten something crucial about retired professors. We don't just collect evidence. We know how to analyze it, contextualize it, and present it in ways that reveal hidden patterns and motivations. The war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to be fought on terms that I understood better than they could imagine. The invitation arrived in my mailbox 3 months after my professional destruction, printed on expensive cardstock with elegant script that made my blood run cold. The Stephen Martinez Family Foundation presents a memorial celebration honoring the legacy of Dr. Richard Martinez. My husband's name. My late husband, whose memory had been sacred to me for 30 years, was being used as the centerpiece of Stephen's latest public relations campaign. The event was scheduled for the university where Richard and I had both taught, in the very auditorium where we had first met during a faculty mixer 45 years ago. According to the invitation, Stephen was establishing a scholarship fund in his father's name and donating Richard's personal library to the university's collection. Personal library. Books that had been in our home, that I had carefully maintained since Richard's death, that Stephen had quietly removed during one of his visits when I still trusted him with keys to my house. I called the university's development office, my voice carefully controlled as I inquired about the event. "Oh, yes," the cheerful coordinator said, "it's going to be wonderful. Mr. Martinez has been so generous, and his tribute to his father's academic legacy is really quite moving. Are you planning to attend? I'm Dr. Martinez's widow," I said quietly. A pause. Oh my, I wasn't aware that, Mr. Martinez handled all the arrangements himself. I just assumed. She assumed that if Stephen was organizing a memorial for his father, his mother would naturally be involved. She assumed that families grieved together, honored their loved ones together, shared the responsibility of preserving legacies together. She had no way of knowing that I had been systematically erased from my own husband's memory. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon with local media coverage and attendance by university dignitaries, former colleagues, and community leaders. Stephen had positioned it as both a tribute to academic excellence and a charitable fundraiser guaranteeing significant attention and social capital for his family. I debated whether to attend. Part of me wanted to stay home to avoid the public humiliation of being treated like a stranger at my own husband's memorial. But a larger part of me, the part that had loved Richard for 25 years and honored his memory for 30 more, couldn't bear the thought of his legacy being rewritten without me there to witness it. So I dressed in my best black dress, the one I had worn to Richard's funeral, and drove to the university campus, where I had once been respected and welcomed. The auditorium was packed. I recognized many faces, former colleagues, university administrators, community members who had known Richard through his various civic activities. I took a seat in the back, hoping to observe without being noticed, but whispers followed me like shadows. "Is that Barbara Martinez?" I heard someone say. "She looks different, older. I heard she's been having some difficulties." "Stephen's been handling things beautifully," came the response. So, mature, taking care of his father's legacy while dealing with his mother's situation. The program began with Stephen taking the podium, looking distinguished and grief-stricken in his perfectly tailored suit. Behind him was a large photograph of Richard in his academic robes, surrounded by images of his published papers and university honors. My father was a man of incredible intellect and integrity. Stephen began his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this speech extensively. He dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of his students and community. The speech continued with carefully selected anecdotes about Richard's professional achievements, his mentorship of young scholars, his commitment to academic excellence. But as Stephen spoke, I noticed what was missing. Any mention of our marriage, our partnership, my role in supporting his career and raising our son. Richard was being presented as a solitary figure of achievement, a brilliant man whose legacy had been preserved and honored by his devoted son. The 25 years we had shared, the love that had defined both our lives, the partnership that had made his success possible, all of it erased as if it had never existed. My father faced challenges in his personal life. Stephen continued his voice, taking on a tone of noble sadness. He carried burdens that others couldn't understand, showed strength in situations that would have broken lesser men. His grace under pressure, his ability to maintain his professional excellence despite personal difficulties, is a testament to his character. Personal difficulties. He was referring to me, to my supposed mental health struggles, my alleged emotional manipulation. Stephen was using his father's memorial to further the narrative that I had been a burden Richard had nobly endured rather than a wife he had loved. But the most devastating moment came when Stephen unveiled a new memorial plaque that would be installed in the university library. The bronze inscription read, "The Dr. Richard Martinez Memorial Collection, donated by his loving son, Stephen Martinez, and family in recognition of a scholar's dedication to truth and intellectual integrity." No mention of his loving wife. No acknowledgement that I had been part of this family, part of this legacy, part of the life that had created the achievements being celebrated. During the presentation, Michael and Emily were brought forward to speak. My grandchildren dressed in formal clothes, and clearly coached delivered short speeches about their wonderful grandfather and how proud they were to honor his memory. Our grandfather was really smart and really kind, Michael said, his 10-year-old voice carrying across the auditorium. Our dad tells us stories about him all the time. We're happy to help keep his memory alive for other kids to learn from. We don't remember him because we were too little, Emily added, but we know he would want us to be good students and help other people learn. Our family is proud to share his books with everyone. They spoke beautifully innocently with the genuine love that children feel for grandparents they've learned to admire. But their words included no acknowledgement of the grandmother who had known their grandfather best, who had shared his daily life and dreams and struggles for 25 years. As the event concluded with a reception in the university's main hall, I found myself standing alone near the display of Richard's books and papers, seeing his handwriting on old notes, his careful annotations in favorite texts, the photographs of him teaching and researching. It felt like visiting his grave. Barbara. I turned to find Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, one of my oldest colleagues approaching with careful steps. Eleanor was nearly 80 now, retired from the English department, where we had both taught for decades. "I was hoping you'd be here," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "This whole thing, it doesn't feel right. Richard would be horrified to see you excluded from his own memorial." "Stephen has his reasons," I said carefully, not wanting to burden Eleanor with the full scope of the family drama. "Does he?" Eleanor's eyes were sharp despite her age. "Barbara, I need to tell you something. Richard came to see me about 6 months before he died. He was troubled, guilt-ridden about something from Stephen's childhood. He asked me to keep something safe said, if anything ever happened to him, if you ever needed to know the truth about his regrets." She pressed a small folded paper into my hand. "He said you knew him better than anyone, that you deserved to know his final thoughts if circumstances ever made it necessary." I looked down at the paper, recognizing Richard's careful handwriting, even in the dim light of the reception hall. "Look for his final words," was all it said, with an address I didn't recognize. "What does this mean?" I whispered. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But Richard was very specific. He said you would understand when the time was right, and that you should never doubt that his love for you was the most real thing in his life." As I drove home from the memorial service, clutching Eleanor's note like a lifeline, I felt something shift inside me. Not just grief for the way my husband's memory had been distorted, but a growing sense that there were truths hidden beneath the surface of our family's story. Richard had been keeping secrets just as I had been keeping secrets to protect Stephen. But his secrets might hold the key to understanding why our son had become capable of such systematic cruelty. The war between truth and convenient narrative was about to take on new dimensions. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might not be fighting alone. My husband, even in death, might still be trying to help me save our son from the patterns of denial and emotional manipulation that had poisoned our family for generations. The address on Eleanor's note led to possibilities I hadn't considered, and possibilities, even small ones, were more hope than I had felt in months. The final assault on my independence began with a phone call from the university's Human Resources Department, delivered in the carefully neutral tone that institutions use when destroying lives through bureaucratic language. "Dr. Martinez, we've completed our investigation into the allegations regarding your teaching methods and professional conduct during your tenure. While we found no evidence of deliberate misconduct, the pattern of complaints and the circumstances surrounding your recent family situation have raised concerns about the university's reputation." I gripped the phone tighter. "What exactly are you saying?" "We're revoking your emeritus status effective immediately. This means your pension benefits will be suspended pending a more thorough review, and your access to university facilities and resources will be terminated." The carefully worded letter that followed made it clear that Stephen's whisper campaign had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Anonymous complaints about my emotional instability and inappropriate classroom behavior had been submitted by people I had never taught. Allegations of ethical lapses were so vague they couldn't be specifically addressed, but damning enough to provide cover for the university's decision. "We understand this is difficult," the HR representative continued, "but the university must protect its reputation and the integrity of its emeritus program. We cannot have former faculty members whose personal situations might reflect poorly on our institution." My personal situation. My son's public campaign to destroy me had now cost me not just my reputation, but my livelihood. The pension that had been my security for over a decade was gone overnight. The health insurance that covered my medications and regular checkups was terminated. The small but comfortable income that had allowed me to maintain my dignity was eliminated by committee vote. Within weeks, the mortgage company was calling. Property taxes that I had always paid punctually were suddenly beyond my reach. Utility bills that had been automatic deductions became insurmountable obstacles. The eviction notice arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who couldn't meet my eyes as he handed me the legal papers. I had 30 days to vacate the home where I had lived for 40 years, where I had raised Stephen, where every room held memories of the life I had built with Richard. I called Stephen one last time, swallowing my pride in a desperate attempt to avoid homelessness. "Stephen, please," I said when he answered his phone. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm about to lose the house. I just need a small loan, just enough to catch up on payments." The silence stretched so long I thought he had hung up. Then Michelle's voice came through the speaker, cold and triumphant. "Barbara, Stephen doesn't want to enable your poor financial decisions. Maybe this is the wake-up call you need to take responsibility for your choices." "My choices," I whispered. "What choices? Having my pension revoked based on false accusations, being blacklisted from employment because of lies about my mental state. Your choice to refuse help." Stephen's voice came back flat and emotionless. "Your choice to continue living in denial instead of accepting reality. We offered you family therapy, professional support, a chance to rebuild your relationship with us. You chose to reject everything and continue your victim narrative." The line went dead, leaving me holding a silent phone in a house that would no longer be mine in 30 days. The local newspaper, apparently tipped off by Michelle, covered my eviction as a human interest story with a twisted angle. "Former university professor faces housing crisis," read the headline, but the article subtly suggested that my financial difficulties were the result of poor decision-making and family estrangement brought on by my own behavior. Dr. Martinez's situation illustrates the challenges that can arise when personal issues impact professional relationships, the reporter wrote. Family members declined to comment, but sources suggest that mental health concerns may have contributed to her current difficulties. Sources: Michelle and Stephen hiding behind anonymous quotes while watching my destruction play out in the local media. The day of the eviction, I sat in my living room surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the remnants of a lifetime. 40 years of books, photographs, mementos, and memories reduced to what I could fit in my car and a small storage unit. Robert showed up as the moving crew was loading my belongings into a truck, but not to offer help. He came with a prepared statement for the reporter who had followed him there. "This is a difficult situation for our family," he said, standing carefully apart from me as cameras rolled. "Barbara has always struggled with accepting responsibility for her choices. She brought this situation on herself through her stubborn refusal to get help for her problems. My own brother, the last family member, who might have offered support publicly, washing his hands of me for the cameras, ensuring that no one would expect him to provide assistance to his homeless sister. The women's shelter was a grim institutional building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. I shared a dormitory-style room with 5 other women, each carrying her own story of how life had gone wrong. Some were fleeing domestic violence, others had lost jobs or struggled with addiction. All of us were learning what it meant to depend on the charity of strangers for basic survival. The intake counselor, a kind woman named Janet, tried to be encouraging. "It's temporary," she assured me. "We'll help you find permanent housing, connect you with resources, get you back on your feet." but I could see in her eyes the same look I had been getting from everyone for months. Pity mixed with suspicion. Even here, among women who had lost everything, I was the oddity. The former professor, whose own family had abandoned her, who must have done something terrible to deserve such complete rejection. That night, as I lay on a narrow cot, listening to the sounds of other women crying or talking in their sleep, I tried to organize the few personal items I had been allowed to keep. Among them was Richard's old poetry book, a volume of Wordsworth that he had carried since graduate school, filled with his handwritten notes and marginalia. As I flipped through the familiar pages, trying to find comfort in his thoughts and reactions to poems we had discussed together, my fingers found something unexpected. A tiny cassette tape, no bigger than a matchbox, tucked into the binding where the pages met the spine. The note Eleanor had given me at the memorial suddenly made sense. Look for his final words. I found an old cassette player in the shelter's community room, the kind of outdated technology that had been donated by someone clearing out their basement. With trembling hands, I inserted the tape and pressed play. Richard's voice filled my ears, tired and haunted in a way I had never heard during his lifetime. Barbara, my love, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and something has gone terribly wrong with our family. There are things I never told you, things I was too ashamed to admit even to myself. I listened in stunned silence as my husband's voice revealed secrets I had never suspected. His own learning disabilities undiagnosed and untreated throughout his childhood and young adulthood. The rage and frustration he had felt at his own limitations, the way he had projected that rage onto Stephen when our son struggled with similar challenges. I was cruel to him, Barbara, crueler than you knew. I called him stupid, worthless, a disappointment. I compared him to other children and found him lacking. I was so ashamed of my own failures that I couldn't bear to see them reflected in my son. The tape continued with Richard's confession of guilt, his understanding that his emotional abuse of Stephen had created lasting damage that might never heal. But it also contained something else. Instructions for accessing a bank account I had never known existed, containing money from his rare book collection that he had been secretly selling and saving. If something happens to me, if Stephen's damage ever threatens your safety or well-being, use this money to protect yourself. And Barbara, tell him the truth about me, all of it. He deserves to understand why he struggles with shame and anger, and he deserves to know that none of it was his fault. I sat in that empty community room at 2 a.m, holding the tape recorder and finally understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had consumed our family. Stephen's cruelty toward me wasn't just learned behavior from his father's treatment of him. It was a multi-generational pattern of emotional abuse that had been hidden and denied for decades. Richard had left me more than money. He had left me the truth. The missing piece that explained why Stephen was capable of such systematic manipulation, why he needed to control narratives and deny reality, why my love threatened him so deeply. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly, but purpose. Richard had given me the tools to break the cycle of abuse that had poisoned our family for generations. The war between Stephen and me was about to enter its final phase, and this time I wouldn't just be fighting for my own survival. I would be fighting to save my son from the demons his father had planted in his soul, even if Stephen couldn't understand that salvation was what he needed. Armed with Richard's confession and the hidden bank account that gave me resources I hadn't possessed in months, I spent 2 weeks crafting what I knew would be my final attempt to reach Stephen, not as his victim, but as his mother, who finally understood the source of his pain. The video took me countless attempts to record properly. I used a small camera I purchased with Richard's emergency funds, setting it up in a quiet corner of the public library where I could speak without interruption. I wanted Stephen to see me clearly, to understand that this wasn't the desperate plea of a broken woman, but the carefully considered message of someone who had discovered a truth that could set us both free. Stephen, my son, I began, my voice steady, despite the weight of what I was about to reveal. For 30 years, I've kept a secret to protect you, but that protection has become a prison for both of us, and it's time for the truth to finally be spoken. I told him about his childhood struggles, his learning disabilities that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. I explained how his frustration with academic tasks had triggered emotional outbursts that his father couldn't understand or tolerate. And then, with my heart breaking for the child he had been, I played portions of Richard's confession tape. Richard's voice filled the recording space, tired and guilt-ridden, as he admitted to the emotional abuse he had inflicted on our son. I called him stupid, worthless, a disappointment. I couldn't bear to see my own failures reflected in him. Stephen, I continued after the tape segment ended, your father loved you, but he was damaged by his own undiagnosed struggles. He took his shame and frustration out on you, and then he spent the rest of his life regretting it. You learned to survive by accepting his version of reality, even when it contradicted your own experience. And now you're using those same survival techniques on me. I explained the cyclical nature of emotional abuse, how children who grow up having their reality denied often become adults who need to control narratives to feel safe. I told him about the bank account Richard had left the money he had saved specifically to help if our family's hidden damage ever surfaced. This isn't about blame or shame, I said, looking directly into the camera. This is about understanding, about breaking patterns that have hurt our family for too long. You're not a bad person, Stephen. You're a wounded child who learned maladaptive ways of protecting himself. But those protective mechanisms are destroying our relationship and teaching your children that love is something to be feared rather than treasured. I ended the video with a simple plea. I love you. I understand you. And I'm willing to work together to heal the damage that's been done to all of us. Your father's final wish was that you understand the truth about his regrets. Don't let his legacy be the continuation of patterns that have caused so much pain. Getting the video to Stephen required finding someone he trusted who hadn't been contaminated by Michelle's narrative. I reached out to Dr. Patricia Wells, his former graduate advisor, who had maintained a relationship with him over the years. Dr. Wells was nearing retirement herself, a woman of intellectual integrity who would understand the importance of truth in family relationships. Barbara, she said when I called, I've been watching this situation with great concern. Stephen has always been a troubled young man, but his recent behavior toward you seems extreme. Yes, I'll make sure he sees your message. The plan was simple. Dr. Wells would invite Stephen to lunch at her office ostensibly to discuss a professional consultation and would ask him to review the video as part of their conversation. Away from Michelle's influence in the presence of someone he respected, he might be open to hearing truths he had spent his lifetime avoiding. But Michelle's network of surveillance was more extensive than I had realized. I was sitting in the public library the next afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Wells. I'm so sorry. Michelle intercepted the message. Stephen saw her take it from me, but she wouldn't let him watch it. He looked confused, conflicted, like he suspected something important was being kept from him. My heart sank and soared simultaneously. Stephen had witnessed Michelle's interception. He had seen her deliberately prevent him from receiving something meant for him something that had clearly been significant enough to warrant her intervention. But that small seed of doubt was quickly crushed by Michelle's swift and brutal retaliation. The press conference was called for the following morning, with local media alerted that there would be important revelations about the ongoing family situation. Michelle stood behind a podium like a prosecutor, holding my video recording like evidence in a criminal trial. Yesterday, she began her voice heavy with manufactured sadness. Barbara Martinez made another desperate attempt to manipulate my husband through psychological warfare. She has now resorted to desecrating the memory of Stephen's beloved father, creating elaborate conspiracy theories to support her delusions. She played selected clips from my video, but they had been edited with surgical precision. My explanation of learning disabilities was presented as my excuse-making for Stephen's supposed failures. Richard's confession was framed as evidence that I had coached him or manipulated him before his death. My understanding words about healing and forgiveness were twisted into evidence of my grandiose delusions about my role in the family. Barbara Martinez is now claiming that she has discovered secret bank accounts and hidden messages. Michelle continued her tone, suggesting that such claims were obviously the products of mental illness. She has manufactured audio recordings supposedly featuring her deceased husband, attempting to rewrite history to make herself appear as a victim rather than taking responsibility for her own behavior. The audience, reporters, community members, and various supporters who had been carefully assembled murmured with sympathy for Michelle's plight and disgust at my supposed manipulation tactics. But it was Robert's appearance that delivered the final blow. My brother took the podium after Michelle, his face set in an expression of righteous indignation. I've watched my sister spiral into increasingly elaborate fantasies for years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of family knowledge. This latest attempt to defame her deceased husband and create fictional bank accounts is the behavior of someone who has completely lost touch with reality. Barbara needs serious psychiatric intervention, and I believe she may be dangerous to herself and others. Dangerous. My own brother was suggesting that I posed a threat to my family's safety. The press conference was picked up by regional news outlets and shared extensively on social media. Within hours, Barbara Martinez was trending with posts mocking my conspiracy theories and praising Michelle for her strength in dealing with such a disturbed family member. The comments were brutal. This woman is clearly mentally ill. Someone needs to get her committed before she hurts someone. I can't believe she's dragging her dead husband into her delusions. Michelle is a saint for putting up with this. People like this are why families need restraining orders. She's obviously dangerous. That evening, I received a call from the women's shelter director. Barbara, I'm sorry, but we've had several complaints about your presence here. Other residents are concerned about the media attention, and frankly, the board is worried about our reputation being associated with this situation. I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to find alternative accommodations. I was being evicted from the homeless shelter. The place that was supposed to be a last resort for women with nowhere else to go was turning me away because my own family's destruction of my reputation had made me too controversial to house. That night, I sat in my car in the shelter parking lot, surrounded by the few possessions I had left, and felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. Not just my heart or my hope, but my fundamental belief that truth mattered, that love was stronger than lies, that good people would recognize manipulation when they saw it. Michelle had successfully turned my love for Stephen into evidence of mental illness. She had weaponized my husband's final attempt to heal our family into proof of my delusions. She had convinced the world that my desperation to save my son was actually a dangerous obsession that threatened everyone around me. But as I sat there in the darkness, playing Richard's tape one more time through the small recorder, I heard something in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. Not just guilt and regret, but determination. Even in death, he was still trying to protect me, still trying to give me the tools I would need to survive what was coming. Tell him the truth, Barbara, all of it. He deserves to understand. The truth, not just about Richard's abuse or Stephen's learning disabilities, but about the systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that had destroyed our family. The truth about Michelle's deliberate isolation tactics, about Robert's cowardly betrayal, about the way mental health stigma had been weaponized to silence me. I might be homeless and branded as delusional, but I still had Richard's resources, his confession, and 30 years of meticulously documented evidence. Most importantly, I had witnessed the moment when Stephen saw Michelle intercept my message. The flicker of doubt in his eyes that suggested some part of him still recognized manipulation when he saw it. The war between truth and lies was entering its final phase. Michelle thought she had won by destroying my credibility so completely that nothing I said would ever be believed again. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated what happens when you back a mother into a corner and threaten not just her own survival, but her child's soul. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits patient and persistent for the moment when lies become too heavy to carry. And that moment, I realized as I started my car and drove toward an uncertain future, was closer than anyone imagined. Barbara's story, when love becomes a burden. The federal courthouse steps felt like climbing toward my own resurrection. 6 months after sleeping in my car and being turned away from homeless shelters, I walked into that building wearing a borrowed suit and carrying 30 years of meticulously documented evidence, Richard's confession tape, and the support of allies I had never expected to find. Dr. Patricia Chen, the forensic linguist who had contacted me after seeing my story on the news, walked beside me with the confidence of someone who had spent her career exposing deception through the scientific analysis of language. Behind us came attorney David Rosen, a specialist in elder abuse cases, who had taken my case pro bono after reviewing the evidence I had preserved. Barbara, Dr. Chen, had told me during our first meeting, "What's been done to you represents one of the most sophisticated gaslighting campaigns I've ever analyzed. But sophisticated lies leave sophisticated evidence. Every public statement Stephen and Michelle made contains linguistic fingerprints that prove deliberate manipulation. The lawsuit we filed was comprehensive defamation, elder abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and what Dr. Chen termed systematic psychological manipulation designed to isolate and control. The case had drawn national attention, partly because of Richard's reputation in academic circles, but mostly because the allegations revealed a level of family manipulation that shocked even experienced legal professionals. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the elder advocacy community who had rallied around my case. Stephen sat with his legal team, looking smaller than I remembered, while Michelle maintained her composed facade, but couldn't hide the tension in her rigid posture. "Your Honor," Attorney Rosen began, "we will present evidence of a calculated campaign to destroy an elderly woman's reputation, isolate her from her family, and systematically erase her from her own life story. This isn't a family dispute. This is psychological warfare conducted with clinical precision." Dr. Chen took the stand, First, her credentials impeccable and her demeanor unshakable. She had analyzed every public statement Stephen and Michelle had made, every social media post, every interview and press conference. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, language analysis reveals patterns that speakers cannot consciously control. When someone is telling the truth, their language shows consistency, emotional authenticity, and natural variation. When someone is deliberately constructing false narratives, their language shows specific markers of deception. She displayed enlarged texts of Stephen's public statements, highlighting linguistic patterns with scientific precision. Notice the consistent use of psychiatric terminology without clinical credentials. Emotional instability, living in fantasy, delusional behavior. This isn't spontaneous description. This is calculated language designed to pathologize normal maternal emotions. Her analysis of Michelle's social media posts was even more damning. Mrs. Martinez consistently uses what we call performative empathy, language that mimics concern while actually expressing dominance. Phrases like, "We're worried about Barbara and she needs help," appear caring, but linguistically function as public declarations of her mental incompetence. But it was Dr. Chen's analysis of the edited video Michelle had used in her press conference that provided irrefutable proof of malicious intent. Side by side, she showed my original words and Michelle's edited version, demonstrating how careful cuts and rearrangements had completely reversed the meaning of my statements. This level of editing requires deliberate intent to deceive, Dr. Chen testified. These weren't accidental misrepresentations. They were sophisticated fabrications designed to make Dr. Martinez appear mentally unstable while preserving plausible deniability. The courtroom was silent as Dr. Chen methodically dismantled every public statement Stephen and Michelle had made, revealing the calculated precision behind their campaign to destroy my credibility. But it was when Attorney Rosen introduced Richard's confession tape that the atmosphere in the room shifted from clinical analysis to profound human tragedy. Your Honor, we will now play the complete unedited recording left by Dr. Richard Martinez, which explains the tragic origins of this family's dysfunction. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, tired and guilt-ridden, but unmistakably authentic. "Barbara, my love, if you're hearing this, it means something has gone terribly wrong. There are things I never told you, things I was too ashamed to admit, even to myself." For 23 minutes, the court listened to my husband's confession. His own undiagnosed learning disabilities, his rage at his own limitations, his projection of that rage onto Stephen during our son's childhood. His voice cracked as he described calling Stephen stupid, worthless, a disappointment, and his growing horror at the emotional damage he was inflicting. I was too proud to get help, too ashamed to admit my own struggles. Instead, I made my son carry the weight of my failures. Barbara protected him as much as she could, but I know I damaged him in ways that may never heal. The tape continued with Richard's instructions about the hidden bank account, his desperate hope that the truth might someday help heal our family, and his absolute certainty that I had been the best mother Stephen could have had under impossible circumstances. As Richard's voice filled the courtroom, I watched Stephen's face transform. The confident public figure who had spent months portraying me as delusional was confronting his father's voice, confirming everything I had tried to tell him about his childhood. The breakdown, when it came, was devastating to witness. Stephen began shaking, first his hands trembling as his father's words stripped away decades of carefully constructed denial. When Richard's voice described the specific incidents of emotional abuse, Stephen's breathing became shallow and rapid. And when the tape revealed Richard's profound guilt and love for the son he had damaged, Stephen collapsed, not in anger or rage, but in the complete psychological disintegration of someone whose entire reality had just been proven false. He doubled over in his chair, gasping for breath, making sounds that were half sobs and half hyperventilation. The confident businessman who had orchestrated my destruction was revealed as a broken child who had never processed his father's abuse. I can't breathe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the tape still playing. He said those things. I remember. Oh God, I remember. Court officers moved to assist him, but Stephen was beyond immediate help. 30 years of repressed trauma were surfacing all at once, triggered by his father's voice, acknowledging the abuse Stephen had been forced to deny his entire life. Michelle's reaction was equally revealing, but far less sympathetic. Seeing Stephen's collapse and the irrefutable evidence of their campaign against me, she attempted to leave the courtroom, apparently hoping to distance herself from the unfolding disaster. When court security prevented her exit, her composed facade shattered into desperate tears and frantic explanations. "He's sick," she said, pointing at Stephen. "He's always been sick. I was trying to protect my children from his instability. Barbara enabled his problems, made everything worse. I was just trying to..." But her words rang hollow in a courtroom that had just heard scientific evidence of her deliberate manipulation and Richard's heartbreaking confession of the truth she had helped Stephen deny. As Stephen was helped from the courtroom by medical personnel, still shaking and repeating, I remember," in a broken voice, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or vindication, but profound sadness for the wounded child my son had always been, and overwhelming gratitude that the truth had finally emerged. The boy who had been emotionally abused by his father had grown into a man who abused others, but he had also become a man capable of recognizing the truth when it could no longer be denied. For the first time in over a year, I allowed myself to hope that healing might be possible, not just for me, but for my entire family. The truth had been revealed. Justice would be served. But more importantly, the cycle of denial and emotional abuse that had poisoned our family for generations had finally been broken. The court's ruling came 3 weeks after Stephen's breakdown, delivered by Judge Margaret Thompson, with the gravity of someone who understood that legal decisions could either heal families or destroy them forever. This court finds that Dr. Barbara Martinez was subjected to a systematic campaign of defamation, elder abuse, and psychological manipulation, Judge Thompson announced. The evidence presented demonstrates that this was not a family dispute, but a calculated effort to isolate an elderly woman and destroy her relationships through the deliberate distortion of truth. The financial judgment was substantial, enough to restore my security and compensate for the professional damage that had been done to my reputation. But more importantly, the court mandated therapeutic intervention designed to address the root causes of our family's dysfunction. Mr. Stephen Martinez will undergo a minimum of 2 years of intensive psychological therapy supervised by this court and funded through the damages awarded to his mother. This is not punitive, but rehabilitative, designed to address the childhood trauma that has clearly contributed to his harmful behavior patterns. Stephen, who had been released from the hospital after 3 days of observation and stabilization, accepted the court's mandate without resistance. The man who had spent months denying his own psychological struggles was now openly acknowledging his need for help. I don't remember agreeing to any of this, he said during his first supervised conversation with me, his voice hollow but no longer hostile. The campaign against you, the press conferences, the legal papers, it's like watching someone else's life. Michelle said she was protecting me, protecting the children. But I think I was just so afraid of remembering what Dad did that I let her convince me you were the problem. The therapy process was slow and often painful to witness. Stephen's psychiatrist, Dr. Amanda Foster, specialized in adults recovering from childhood emotional abuse. She explained to me during one of our family sessions how trauma could remain dormant for decades before surfacing in destructive ways. Stephen learned to survive your husband's abuse by dissociating from his own emotional reality, she said. When you tried to remind him of his childhood struggles, it triggered the same psychological defenses he used as a child. Michelle exploited those defenses, convincing him that his fear and confusion were caused by you rather than by unprocessed trauma. But Stephen was making progress. Slowly, carefully, with professional guidance, he was learning to distinguish between his father's voice and his own thoughts, between Michelle's manipulation and his genuine feelings. Michelle's fate was far less hopeful. The court had found her liable for defamation, elder abuse, and what Judge Thompson called the systematic psychological manipulation of minor children. The financial penalties were severe, but the social consequences were devastating. Her carefully constructed public image crumbled overnight. Friends who had supported her during the campaign against me now viewed her with suspicion and disgust. Professional associations distanced themselves from someone who had been exposed as capable of such calculated cruelty. Within months, David had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, but privately expressing horror at the woman he had discovered beneath Michelle's charming facade. I thought I married someone who was protective of family, he told me during one awkward encounter. I had no idea she was capable of destroying someone so methodically. Michelle's isolation was complete and apparently permanent. The social standing she had worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by the reputation of someone who had manipulated children and abused an elderly woman for personal gain. But it was the court-mandated reunification with Michael and Emily that brought me the greatest joy and hope. The process was handled by Dr. Sarah Kim, a child psychologist who specialized in helping families recover from parental alienation. She worked with the children individually and together, carefully explaining how adults sometimes say things that aren't true when they're scared or angry. Your grandmother loves you very much, she told them during one of our early supervised visits. Some of the things you were told about her weren't true. They were said by people who were confused and scared, but that doesn't make the things they said right. Michael, now 11, was the first to reach out tentatively. Grandma Barbara, did you really try to hurt Daddy? Mom said you were mean to him when he was little. The question broke my heart, but Dr. Kim had prepared me for this moment. Michael, I loved your daddy very much when he was little, just like I love you now. Sometimes when people are hurt, they remember things differently than they really happened. Your daddy was hurt by his daddy, your grandfather, and that made him confused about what really happened with me. It took months of patient work, but gradually, my grandchildren began to remember the grandmother they had known before Michelle's campaign. Emily, now 9, was the first to initiate physical contact, climbing onto my lap during a visit and asking if I would read her the same stories I used to read when she was little. I missed our stories, she whispered. I was sad when Mom said we couldn't see you anymore, but I was afraid to say anything. The most unexpected reconciliation came from Robert. My brother, who had publicly abandoned me during my darkest hour, appeared at my door 6 months after the trial, carrying flowers and wearing an expression of profound shame. "Barbara, I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice barely steady. "What I did to you, abandoning you when you needed family, most supporting their lies about your mental state, there's no excuse for it. I was a coward and I let my own fears make me complicit in your abuse." His apology was complete and unflinching. He acknowledged every betrayal, every public statement he had made against me, every opportunity he had missed to support me when I was being systematically destroyed. "I don't know if we can ever be siblings again," he continued, "but I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends for what I did to you." Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't always a single decision, but sometimes a gradual process of choosing healing over bitterness. Robert's genuine remorse and consistent efforts to rebuild trust slowly opened the door to a cautious reconciliation. My victory in court had vindicated my truth and restored my reputation, but it came with emotional costs I hadn't anticipated. Watching Stephen struggle to rebuild his sense of reality was heartbreaking, even as it was necessary for his healing. Seeing my grandchildren work through the confusion of having been manipulated was painful, despite the joy of having them back in my life. The public nature of our family's trauma had exposed us all to scrutiny and judgment that felt invasive and overwhelming. My story had become a cautionary tale about family manipulation, which meant constant requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and advice from other families in similar situations. But underneath the complexity and pain of our healing process was something I had thought I might never feel again. Hope, real sustainable hope based on truth rather than wishful thinking. Stephen was learning to separate his father's voice from his own thoughts. My grandchildren were rediscovering their love for me without the poison of false narratives. Robert was proving through consistent actions that people could change and make amends for past betrayals. The family that emerged from our crisis was different from the one that had been destroyed by lies and manipulation. We were more careful with each other, more aware of the power of words and the importance of truth. We had learned that love without honesty is fragile, but love grounded in truth and mutual respect can survive almost anything. As I sat in my small apartment, reading a bedtime story to Emily over video chat, while Michael worked on homework at my kitchen table during his weekend visit, I understood that victory sometimes looks different than we expect. I had won more than a legal case. I had won back the possibility of authentic relationships based on truth rather than convenient fictions, and that I realized was worth every moment of pain it had taken to achieve. 2 years after the trial that changed everything, I stood in the garden behind my new home, watching Michael help Emily plant tomatoes in the raised beds we had built together. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, and their laughter filled the air with a sound I had thought I might never hear again. Stephen approached from the house, carrying glasses of lemonade and moving with the careful deliberation of someone still learning to trust his own emotional responses. The therapy had changed him in fundamental ways, not back to the boy he had been before his father's abuse, but forward to the man he was capable of becoming. "Mom," he said, using the word more easily now, but still with a hint of wonder, as if he was rediscovering what it meant to have a mother. "Doctor, Foster says my progress has been exceptional. She thinks I'm ready to start individual visits with the kids without supervision." The supervised visits had been difficult for all of us, but they had been necessary. Stephen needed to learn to interact with his children without the toxic patterns he had absorbed from Michelle, and Michael and Emily needed to see their father working to become healthier rather than simply reverting to old behaviors. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it completely. "You've worked so hard to get here." Stephen's journey had been painful to witness, but inspiring in its thoroughness. He had confronted not just his father's abuse, but his own role in perpetuating cycles of emotional manipulation. He had learned to recognize the difference between Michelle's voice in his head and his own authentic feelings. Most importantly, he had developed the tools to break patterns that might otherwise have been passed down to another generation. "I want to apologize to you again," he said, a ritual that had become important to his healing process. "Not just for what I did, but for what I failed to see. You spent my entire childhood protecting me from Dad's anger, and I repaid you by doing exactly what he did, making you question your own reality, making you feel like your love was a burden." "Stephen," I said gently, "healing isn't about perfect apologies. It's about consistent choices to do better. And you've been making those choices every day for 2 years." Our relationship now was different from what it had been before Michelle's campaign, but it was also deeper and more honest. We talked about difficult things. His memories of his father's abuse, my regrets about the secrets I had kept to protect him, the ways trauma had shaped both our responses to conflict and intimacy. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that seems unique to young minds. They understood, in age-appropriate terms, that their mother had said and done things that weren't true because she was scared and angry. They knew that sometimes adults make mistakes, even big ones, and that families can heal from those mistakes with help and time. "Grandma Barbara," Emily said, running over with dirt-stained hands and a proud smile, "look how many seeds we planted. We're going to have so many tomatoes, and we can make that sauce you taught us." Michael added, "The one with the secret ingredient." The secret ingredient was simply love, patient attention to the process of growing and creating something nurturing together. But I didn't correct him. Some secrets are worth keeping. Michelle's fate had settled into a predictable pattern of isolation and bitterness. She had moved to another state after the divorce, apparently seeking a fresh start where her reputation hadn't preceded her. According to David, who maintained minimal contact for the children's sake, she had not learned from the experience or sought therapy to address her manipulative behaviors. "She still insists that she was protecting the family from your influence," David told me during one of our brief conversations. "She's never taken responsibility for what she did, and I don't think she ever will. Some people would rather be right than be healthy." Robert's redemption had been more thorough and consistent. He had spent the past 2 years not just apologizing for his betrayal, but actively working to rebuild our relationship through small, careful gestures of support and loyalty. "I want to show you something," he said, joining us in the garden with a large envelope in his hands. "I've been working on a project." Inside was a carefully compiled photo album chronicling my life from childhood through the present. Pictures I thought had been lost, documents from my academic career, newspaper clippings about my advocacy work, a complete record of a life that Michelle and Stephen had once tried to erase. "I tracked down everything I could find," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every award, every achievement, every moment of joy. I wanted to create something that could never be taken away from you again." The album was more than a collection of photographs. It was a testimony to the power of reconstruction, the possibility of rebuilding what has been torn down, the importance of witnesses who remember and preserve truth. My advocacy work had grown beyond anything I had expected. What had begun as sharing my story with support groups had evolved into speaking at conferences, consulting with legal teams, and writing articles about elder abuse and parental alienation. Dr. Martinez, the conference organizer, had said at my most recent speaking engagement, "Your presentation on psychological manipulation in families has become one of our most requested topics. Have you considered writing a book?" The book was already half written, drawn from the journals I had kept throughout my ordeal and the insights I had gained through therapy and recovery. But more than a memoir, it was becoming a practical guide for families facing similar manipulation, a roadmap for professionals working with alienated parents and children. The senior discussion group I had joined at the community center had become my chosen family in many ways. 8 women who met twice weekly to discuss books' current events and the challenges of aging with dignity. They had supported me through the darkest period of my life and celebrated every victory in my recovery. "Barbara," Margaret said during our most recent meeting, "you've become a different person over these past few years. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've reclaimed who you always were underneath the damage." That evening, as Stephen helped the children clean up from our gardening project and Robert grilled vegetables for dinner, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who had been systematically gaslighted and isolated, who had slept in her car and been turned away from homeless shelters, was now surrounded by authentic relationships based on truth and mutual respect. The grandmother who had been legally prohibited from seeing her grandchildren was now an integral part of their daily lives. The mother whose love had been weaponized against her was now helping her son learn to love in healthy ways. The transformation hadn't been magical or sudden. It had required legal battles, therapy sessions, uncomfortable conversations, and the painstaking work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of manipulation. But it had been worth it. Every moment of pain, every night of despair, every instance of standing alone against a wall of lies. All of it had led to this garden, this family, this life, grounded in truth rather than convenient fictions. As we sat around the dinner table that evening, sharing stories and laughter, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. The goal of healing isn't to return to what was, but to move forward to what's possible. We would never be the family we might have been if Richard's abuse and Michelle's manipulation had never happened. But we had become something else. A family that understood the value of truth, the importance of individual healing, and the power of love that's strong enough to survive even the worst kinds of betrayal. The elderly woman who had once questioned her own sanity was now completely certain of her reality. The mother who had been told her love was toxic was now surrounded by children and grandchildren who sought her wisdom and comfort. The professor who had been stripped of her dignity was now using her intellect and experience to help other families navigate similar crises. My life was fuller and more purposeful than it had ever been, grounded in authentic relationships and meaningful work, rather than the false harmony that had once passed for family peace. This was what victory looked like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of truth. Not the restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something better than what had existed before. As I write this today, 5 years after the trial that vindicated my truth and restored my family, I sit in the study of a home filled with the sounds of genuine happiness. Michael's voice carries from the kitchen, where he's teaching Emily to make pasta from scratch, while Stephen works in the garden that has become our shared sanctuary. The walls around me are lined with books, photographs, and letters from families across the country who have found hope in my story. The journey from systematic destruction to authentic healing has taught me lessons I never expected to learn at 75 years old. I discovered that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fires, that truth has a power that lies can never match, and that families can be rebuilt on foundations stronger than their original structures when that rebuilding is done with honesty and professional guidance. My relationship with Stephen is deeper now than it ever was before Michelle's campaign nearly destroyed us. We talk openly about difficult things. His memories of his father's abuse, my regrets about the secrets I kept to protect him, the ways we both learned unhealthy patterns that took years to unlearn. Our love is no longer based on convenience or unexamined assumptions, but on the hard-won understanding that comes from facing truth together. Michael and Emily, now teenagers, have grown into young people who understand that families can survive terrible challenges when they commit to honesty and healing. They know their grandmother fought for them when they couldn't fight for themselves, and they carry that knowledge as a foundation for their own future relationships. The advocacy work that grew from my personal trauma has become a calling that gives meaning to every moment of pain I endured. The book I wrote about family manipulation and recovery has helped thousands of families recognize and address similar patterns. The speaking engagements, support groups, and consultations have created a community of survivors who support each other through the long process of healing. But perhaps the most profound lesson of my journey has been understanding that happiness doesn't require the absence of pain, but rather the presence of truth. The family that emerged from our crisis bears scars from the manipulation and abuse we survived, but those scars have become sources of wisdom rather than shame. We learned that love without boundaries is not really love at all, but that boundaries drawn with compassion can create space for authentic intimacy to flourish. We discovered that forgiveness is not about forgetting or minimizing harm, but about choosing healing over perpetual anger. Most importantly, we proved that no matter how sophisticated the lies, how complete the isolation, or how systematic the manipulation, truth has a way of surfacing when people are brave enough to document it, preserve it, and fight for it. To those who may recognize pieces of their own story in mine, I want you to know this. Your reality is valid, your pain is real, and your fight for truth is worth every moment of struggle it requires. The people who try to convince you that your memories are unreliable, that your feelings are excessive, that your love is toxic, they are using your capacity for self-doubt against you. Trust your instincts, document your experiences, seek allies who can help you distinguish between gaslighting and genuine feedback. And never forget that a life lived in truth, however difficult, is infinitely preferable to a life built on lies, however comfortable those lies might seem. The war between authenticity and manipulation is as old as human relationships themselves, but in every generation there are people who choose truth over convenience, who fight for genuine connection over false harmony, who understand that real peace can only be built on foundations of honesty and respect. I am proud to be one of those people, and I am grateful every day for the journey that transformed my deepest pain into my greatest source of strength and purpose. In the end, that transformation is the truest victory of all. Barbara's story, When Love Becomes a Burden,